Welcome back to day 2 of Radio Days from Autistic Radio. At this time of year, every year, between Christmas and New Year, we make extra broadcasts, live broadcasts of some of the things that we would normally do as recordings. And today I'm looking back with a little bit of nostalgia about some of the work we did earlier on in our journey. I've picked out a recording from the series A Seat at the Table. We named it episode 1 at that point. We were trying to work it out as we went along. How did we bring autism professionals into a space where autistic people themselves were also comfortable? And then also, how did we break through into the way things were organised for us on our behalf? How did we make it so that what we knew about our autism was also available to the professionals? Over this last year, I have to say that there have been very mixed results trying to get a meaningful input from the autistic community. I have a specific example in mind, and that was one where here in Scotland a funder had arranged to offer money to support the adult autistic community, the people who are often called late diagnosed because they've been diagnosed or they realise their autism in their adult life rather than as children. That money was offered in a very progressive way to our minds here at Autistic Radio. When the wording was put forward by the funding body, it promised to only allocate money to organisations who took a meaningful input from the autistic community, and it required the input from the wider community in such a way that it looked to us as though co-production was being offered. It looked to us as though only organisations that really did have a relationship with autistic groups so that they could take a meaningful input from those groups would be funded. We followed all of the different organisations, and when we followed them, we were disappointed. I specifically was disappointed, and I want to refresh my mind and go back a year and see what we were saying back as far as February 2024, and then see what we have to comment on that now that we've seen how things worked out. What would we say, or what would we do differently? I'm going to play one of the podcasts that we have out there that I've removed from our normal playlist. I want to look at it again with fresh eyes and see how we would re-edit this and what we would put in instead. This is an Autistic Radio production for autisticradio.com. We have a new, large, ongoing conversation happening here at autisticradio.com. and it's become part of our mission statement. We're talking about the meaning of being at the table. I know the phrase from being at the table from business setting. It used to mean that the people around the table had the power, they shared it, and everyone got listened to. In other contexts, however, it might mean something different. That was made clear to me when I used the phrase recently in another context. It was a conversation with an autism professional. I said to them, "Do we have a place at the table?" And they came back to me with, "Well, what does that mean to you? What does being at the table look like?" So in the next 4 programs, I'm going to be asking the group, and in some programs following that, I'm going to be asking autism professionals themselves, what does a seat at the table mean for autistic people in relationship to autism professionals? Anybody who wants to add their words, let's join in. What do others feel about that?
That encompasses any form of communication where we agree to next steps and each, well, I would say, side and a confrontation of each category of participants of the two move for proposed next steps, because you never know who's going to have inspiration. Folks who start projects, nothing wrong with them having inspiration, but it's agency and whether the inspiration's gone with or sent back to the table to think something different.
Teamwork, working together, keeping all of ourselves up to date and being totally transparent. It doesn't mean tokenistic bum on seat, which there's been felt by many people in the past, particularly people with autism, in terms of projects and things that have been done. Even the ones that have been pretty good, there's always been that level of feeling tokenistic rather than being an equal partner. And that's the sort of kind of instant response I give.
I think sort of broadly it means being involved, but I don't think it's the same picture for every context. I mean, if somebody was doing, say, a research project about autistic people and it was for their PhD, they might have autistic people on a committee informing about like research design, possible issues that they might have overlooked if the researcher isn't autistic, about how to word questionnaires or how to administer questionnaires and things like that. If it's somebody's sort of research project for a PhD, a seat at the table doesn't mean that we would get to steer the direction of that project or to define the scope of that project or to set the question. But a seat at the table at a project, say that a project that was going to be collaborative and needs to have the input of autistic people in the very scope and design of that project, then a seat at the table looks very different. We're sort of at the head of the table deciding who else gets invited to the table in that context. So I think it depends on the type of the project, really. I think it looks different depending on what the context is.
Can't be said to be, is it a personal project of a person pursuing a particular idea research context, or is it a project in society where we're all agents in society who should be more equal?
Everybody is saying it's very much context dependent. In my previous work, the table has always been a round one. It's had more akin to the Knights of the Round Table, where people of different specialisms, different responsibilities in an organisation have had a position where they face each other, but there's no real hierarchy. Then I know that there's another type of table, and people like Putin use these types of table where somebody is sitting in a rather grand position and other people are seated in distances away from the seat of power. And that is a very set up to be a hierarchical situation. What do we want as autistic people if we're to make real change and difference for the services that are provided for us?
Experience dependent, isn't it? I mean, if it's something working on autism experience, autistic way of living, the autism itself, I mean, you would hope it'd be an equal footing, even if you're with people who have got all these qualifications in social work and kind of mental health and all kinds of things, because the information that I can't see a hierarchy there. If we all work together quite equally, I think things would go a lot quicker as well.
But like the cabinet, I suppose, there's decision parity. What we've got our name to, we've got a sameness of agency over, but there's two fair ways of describing that. Every person involved having a vote, and where it's collective. Fairest, the most most even way seen from among the bands of folks involved. Having a sameness of say that's not like the one guy at the end of the table.
I was interested in what you said there, Morris, because you said something about it. If something is in our name, if something has been described as from us, if something has been described as collaborative with us, then having a seat at the table is something very much more equality based. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's absolutely, yeah, but that's kind of common sense. That the nature of having that name is of being a co-agent, and you're only a co-agent if you're.
I don't think everyone thinks it is.
You're a co-agent if you're equal, pretty much in your agency over it.
I don't think everyone thinks it is common sense. I don't think everyone understands it that way.
Well, everyone who analyses it from the perspective of the actual involvement. I mean, so someone more remotely ticking a box might say, well, we got them on board, tick that because it sounds good. But the history of democracy's always had appearance versus substance, tokenism versus real leverage. So scrutinise that.
I understand what Liz is saying about the context, and she described a project like a PhD, which would have lots of different parts of it. When decisions are being made on our behalf, my thought is that we should be very much more at the table in the kind of equal way that you mean, Morris. Is that something that's generally accepted by everyone else, or just me?
When you say on our behalf, that's a very wide and very diverse community. So making decisions on behalf of the entire autistic community is a huge undertaking. It's a massive task.
I agree with you. How about if it was something that was much more specific, that went to a much more defined group of autistic people? Say it was about people who had recently found themselves to be late diagnosed, different sectors of our community. Do you think that there should be some kind of equality in the voices there?
I think there should be some kind of equality. But I think with a seat at the table in terms of scoping and parameter and provision and design of support services, for example, that's got to be weighed up with responsibility. And I think people who get to input into that process, for it to be fair on everyone, people who are able to input directly and make decisions about what is actually going to happen, not just be consulted and say, I think you should do this, but it's your decision. If you've actually got decision-making power, I think there needs to also be some responsibility for actually delivering. It's quite easy, if you're not involved in executing a project, to have some very big ideas about what the project should look like. When you're in charge of the budget, that has a huge impact on the decisions that you can make. It constricts the decisions you can make. For a seat at the table or a role in shared decision making to be effective, I think it needs to be in a context where you are involved fully in the project, from scoping to design to implementation and feedback and refining and tweaking. I think you need to be involved all the way through and have that responsibility. The Centre of Excellence at Cambridge has asked people for feedback and input on the wording and the content of a mental health project that they're running at the moment. And I really relish the chance to get involved. And when someone says, hey, what do you think about this? I'll absolutely give way more information than they probably even want. Would I want to be in-depth involved in actually running and executing all those projects? No.
Involved people can input on aspects and the items that they've got something to say on. Why do we have to have a heavy time just was going through every line of the budget, yes, you're co-responsible there being a budget, but it come from the design stage, and the folks who are more inspiration in the design are going to have more inspiration for that was coming up with a first version of a budget, in that everyone's got agency then towards its content. But it's the same as when you do these answers about the questions asked in a Cambridge project. You don't have to give a view on every single question, and your value in giving views on the questions is self-contained to that task, and does not mean that you have to be an active co-runner of the whole project. There's a saying things when you've got something to say aspect to the involvement.
So having a seat at the table is not responsibility for the whole table. We're expecting there to be other people with other responsibilities. And Liz is pointing out that with any kind of seat at any table, there is a responsibility. So the people who are taking that seat need to jolly well understand that there is a responsibility.
It's a responsibility. It's not a responsibility for every person to do and replicate every task as if they were running the thing on their own. One of the practicalities is a pooled sharing of work, and folks have different areas of ability to engage. what you don't engage with, you're responsible for being happy with. Or perhaps with backing someone else's engagement with them.
Let's look at ourselves as a group, and we have been together for some years, varied backgrounds in working with autistic professionals over the years, or training, or other quasi-professions. As a group, are we ready to be at the table as a collective group?
I would say so, yes. I mean, the main thing, the thing I always worry about with doing anything is take too much on alone. But if it's kind of spread out in a more kind of even way, it's certainly workable. But I do think that, from my opinion, this group is certainly ready to be around the table, as long as it's not tokenistic. If it was tokenistic, we probably could write it out, but it would seem a very frustrating experience if it felt tokenistic in the end. But a bit further than that, I think we are ready to be involved in some projects, just as long as there's a bit of flexibility for everybody as well. That's the main thing.
I'm not sure that we are a cohesive group with agreed shared policies, especially with, the radio work that we do. We're more a collaboration of individuals. We do represent a variety of stances and opinions and backgrounds, which is a good thing. That the diversity is a good thing. When you're working with other groups, they would expect us to have some sort of agreed policies, as it were. Like, I'm doing the air quotes, policies and inverted commas, and definitions of things.
If the agency, the partnership is for the inserting of insights into what's being done, then the range of views becomes a good thing, and so it's more that they're working with a collective. That can be on the professional side too. That they can also be a collective or a partnership whose mutual relation in the project is also quite loose. But they would have a commonality.
The variations of opinions and views that we have, I think that's a strength, because it shows that we're human, it shows that we're individuals, and it breaks down the stereotypes of, the artistic stereotypes. It's showing you there's just a few collection of people, and they're all completely different. I think I would go for it if we were working in collaboration with someone else.
I haven't come across a group in all of my time in business that has worked as a decision-making team as effectively as the group I'm in right now. I think it's something to do with the fact that we are all autistic and we do communicate in a different way from the outside world. And I think we may be underestimating the value that has and overestimating how the rest of the world looks in their hierarchies. There's always a need to have differences of thought, opinion to be brought to the table. It's whether the group has the ability to negotiate that. And it seems to me that we prove that again and again and again.
Well, we could certainly represent a variety of opinions. One of the few things we're for 100% agreed on is that we're all individually responsible for what we say. That can't be the case if we're a group. As a cohesive group, that people need to be jointly and severally responsible. That means putting your name potentially to something you don't agree with, or to something that doesn't represent you.
But that's at the level of the whole project, isn't it? the whole
Yeah. And if
professionals
if
and
that's
us
the seat
together.
at the table, if the seat is collective as a group.
Well, I think the seat is of the persons at that sort of level, that sort of issue, and the collective level is the whole project. It's not. It doesn't need a sub-collective level of within the bigger collective of the partnered projects.
To me, it's absolutely necessary for autistic people to be willing to take a seat at the table and organise themselves in a way that makes that seat valid for as wide a range of autistic people as they can do. And I think we're potentially putting ourselves to much higher standards than generally exist in organisations. And the reality at the moment is so poor of the representation of autistic people. It's almost as though you could do it quite badly and still do it better than the exclusion we have at the moment. Because I don't really see a seat at the table in decisions that are made about designing services for us in any meaningful way.
How would you describe our role with Scottish Autism Network? Just as a kind of point.
Well, when it was
like a real life point.
Well, when it was actually the government budgeted university based network as a institution rather than the self-employed collective, continuity from that as it is now, then our role was involved in talking about what was going on, what needed doing, and having somewhere for what we were saying to go to. The issue of seeing that it went somewhere effective was when I was always working on, because at the start of the thing it wasn't clear in any structural way where it was going to, as if it was just something that could be cited in some professional conversations here and there, so we need to make it a bit more definite than that, and we were doing towards the end. We were tracking how it was reaching points of decision and being heard there. That's why it was such a great democratically empowering experiment, one that had not been delivered by the big charities.
I'd like to answer that quite bluntly, Liz. We don't have a relationship with the Scottish Autism Network. Since the period that Morris is talking about, when it was the ANS, the Autistic Network Scotland, as soon as they dropped their funding, they pretty much stopped having forums with us. And it was only because we kept reaching out to them that we managed to keep any kind of contact with them at all. We have tried to foster a relationship, and we have had cooperation with them on different pieces, but we have a completely separate charity. We have a completely separate organisation called Autistic Radio, and we have a forum called Spectrum Voices.
Right, I'm really sorry. I think I've asked the wrong question. I think I've got the name of an organisation wrong. So
we're Okay. Well, the answer is still the same for that. We do not have any formal association with any professional body. We just have the luck sometimes of them coming and speaking with us and taking part voluntarily with us. That's all we have.
I perceive their willingness at the time of the changeover more charitably than Julian does, but that's two perspectives. But certainly it is voluntarily in this present period.
There are people called lead officers in Scotland in different council areas. Some people take that seriously, some people don't. Some people don't even know that they are the lead officer in their area for autism. The ones that take it seriously tend to go to meetings. We have now 3 meetings, had the opportunity through 2 individuals to make presentations from the outside at those meetings and other meetings like COSPA. But we have no relationship with any organisation. We are entirely independent as a group.
I think they were working relationships. That they weren't like affiliations.
For something to be a seat at the table, does there have to be some kind of formal affiliation then? Is that the definition of seat at the table?
Well, I think in the seat at the table of a project it would be, because you're co-partners in the project. So it's a sort of affiliation, but it's an more equal affiliation than a dog and a tail.
Right.
Let's ask a different question. How do you think, as an autistic person, we should be cooperating with the professions to make changes in the way autism is both seen and also the services that are created for autistic people? How do you think we should be involved if we forget about calling it a seat at the table, Liz?
Well, that very recently, and with indeed the same network folks, done something very good for me in things that need more researching and more understanding about at the level they're being decided on. There are apparently, they tell me, these professional channels where they get to circulate calls for research among each other. It's accidental, atypical piece of luck at present, which should be the standard, what we have, to be able to ourselves bring something I've brought up. These Autism Network folks has good contacts, putting into those channels to see if anyone is currently undertaking anything like the topic needed and flag it up to be done. That's the sort of agency you don't have with the remote big charities, and you do have where you've got personal connections in it, so the type of thing that's and helped to develop was so good in developing, and thus feeling the benefits of again.
You have a personal connection with people that you've built up over the years, and that's not a group creating a seat at the table. And you are the seat. You are the person who has the seat at that table.
No, I think we all potentially do. And I just found a use for my seats recently that I needed.
Well, it looks as though we're just scratching the surface. From what people have been inspired to say so far, it looks like we've got a long way to go to explore this, both as a group, how effectively we can make a difference for autistic people, and also in explaining the position that autistic people like ourselves, as individuals and as a collective, feel that we may not be getting a seat at the table. Well, listening to that back, I can hear so many interesting points from the autistic group, really thinking in depth about what their responsibilities would be if they had a seat at the table. People saying that it was a necessary part, but they themselves, as individuals, were concerned that they might be asking too much of themselves, and that they if they were part of a group that had some kind of influence or seat at the table in something, that it would be too much, and that their personal ideas wouldn't be represented because they would have to go alongside a group. And we also had somebody there who was confident in lots of ways that they already had a way in. They already had a personal way in to create a seat at the table, and that other people would be able to follow that. Almost a year on from that, we watched that relationship between Autistic Radio, Autistic Association, the Autistic Charity, and what we found was that we were dumped. As soon as the group asked for more representation, the professionals were no longer interested in working with us. As soon as we asked them to put actions to their words, we were disappointed. Eventually, over that period of time, we challenged them more and more, and it culminated in us finding that there had been an absolute opportunity to offer us a seat at the table, because the group we were speaking about, the Autism Network, Richard Ibbotson, had been making quiet applications for funding that required the input of autistic people, and he was keeping us in the back pocket. We weren't being involved, we weren't having a seat at the table, but right at the last minute, when we discovered that they had the opportunity to involve us in something in co-production, everything had already been organised. Everything had already been decided. If we were to have a seat at the table, it was a table where everything had already been set for a banquet, and we could do little more than maybe removing a couple of the forks. So this hopeful idea that an autistic group puts out, discussing in detail what they think a seat at the table might look for them, and then putting it in front of the people that we hoped would be working with us, wasn't effective for us. We found that while we were trying to work out what would be the absolute best scenario, the status quo was happening behind our backs, and it was just another version of tokenism. Eventually this led to us rejecting the tiny bits of offerings that they gave to us. We looked at what they said and looked at what they offered. Tiny scraps of money to do ridiculously large projects. We looked at the way they had allocated their money to empty rooms instead of looking for autistic people to represent themselves. It was a fraud. We took the presentation of what we found to a large conference, the Colicon, and though we didn't mention Richard Ibbotson by name, we called him Dick, we clearly set out all of the problems that we had learnt from, all of the red flags that an autistic group should try and avoid if they are supposedly being offered a seat at the table or a meaningful input. in that presentation, we put out what you should look for to set off alarm bells in your head. What a shame. An autistic group who were comprised of adult diagnosed people were excluded from a seat at the table when there was money involved. Money which was aimed at the group, aimed at late diagnosed people. Fortunately, during that time, we kind of knew this was going on and we had background information. So we were able to follow other schemes under the same funding that really did work, that really did take a meaningful input from autistic people, that did offer a seat at the table. And you know what? The one that was best out of all of those was an autistic group, an autistic professional group that took on the whole job, that created the service, designed the service in relationship with their own autistic group, and not only did they produce a program that people are proud of and proud to have become part of, the program continues and it networks people and it has a follow-on part of it. Whereas the autism professionals that refused a seat at the table produced a few flashcard meetings to disturb people in their newly understood expression of autism, their new diagnosis, their new way of thinking, and then dump them without any follow-up. The autistic group created a model as autistic professionals that was available to every single one of the other funding recipients, because they did a very simple thing. They followed the information that they were required. They actually asked autistic people what would be best, what would be beneficial, and they made the huge difference, which was that after they had exposed people to lots of information, they allowed them to network together in a group. They allowed them to continue to ask questions and become a self-sustaining support network. I don't know if anybody else listening at the moment in the different studios feels like commenting on any of this before I move on.
No, I think you explained that quite well. I had a number of questions, but you've answered them. Specifically, what was this group's name? The favourable autistically led one.
That's Autistic Knowledge Development. They took the same funding from eventually Scottish Government, but they followed the rules of what the funding was, and then I was lucky enough to be invited to the Scottish Parliament, to a room there where they presented their what they had done and what they had achieved. And around the table there were Scottish ministers and Scottish MSPs, and also many of the other organisations that had taken the same funding. It's always difficult to get your point across, so I only stood up and made one short statement, but it was really well listened to. And I said that we, as Autistic Radio, had only found that one presentation, that one group, to have followed the expectations of the funding. And it was a rather frosty, shocked audience in some parts, because they knew that they were being criticised directly. We had watched some of the groups take the money from the funding arrangement and put on a small bit of information for late diagnosed people, but then use the majority of the money in their regular need for funding. So what was actually spent was a small percentage of what it was aimed for. A small percentage of the money that they claimed actually produced a support structure for late diagnosed people. The rest of it went into their general funds.
I want to dwell on the positive sides of AKD. You're defining them as professionals and autistic, which is the difference between themselves and the general groups within that area you were working within. So you promote this group, or you favour this group in a sense. So I want to dwell on that, because how did they get there? How were they even allowed to get there? If it's or are they just an initial kind of entrance for this kind of group?
Wow, that is a tough question, and it's a difficult one, and it doesn't reflect well on the future, because autistic knowledge development is actually made of people who originally were working in autism as professionals in autism, who then came to their own diagnoses later. So they already had a seat at the table because they were professionals working within autism. I don't remember their exact titles that they were working with. And it was they themselves that have worked strategically over years of grinding against the status quo. And I would say that what they have managed to do recently is the renaissance. It's the change. It's the paradigm shift happening. They have come entirely out of the woodwork, worked tirelessly under the radar, then made themselves obvious, and now they have meaningful connections with one of the big charities here, Scottish Autism. So they were professionals who were also autistic, working alongside the charity. So another group who start from just being autistic and then trying to make themselves some kind of quasi-professionals or lived experience professionals or experts by experience, whatever the term you want to use, that's a much tougher road. That's a lot harder. Autistic knowledge development started from being professionals. What we need now, in my opinion, is other opportunities where people who didn't have a background in autism but are autistic and come from other backgrounds like health and business and all kinds of other ways through, they're the people that we need within it, but they're the people who are going to have the tougher way of getting in. I think Autistic Knowledge Development are one of those organisations that want to give those opportunities, and I think I do support them. It's not just I feel as though anything we can do to support autistic knowledge development through any of our activities is a positive thing for things generally, for autistic people generally, because they do appear to be the people who will open up opportunities to people like ourselves. It was through them that we recently were offered some funding to keep autistic radio expanding. So they're keeping up their end of the bargain. My experience of working with them has been absolutely the opposite of working with the Autism Network.
Yeah, I just typed in there, I'm hoping they enable a new economic reality, because we have to deal with economy and economics, but it's like the way we use these economics and our value system. So if somebody can get a Jamie in the door there and work within it, that's good news. We just need to monitor it as it goes on.
Yeah, I think you're really right to concentrate on the economics of this. In the conversation in the broadcast earlier, one of the contributors, Liz, was very concerned that if you're an autistic group, or if you're not taking responsibility for the whole economics of it, then you can come up with fanciful ideas of what should be done and then just complain and argue for them. And she's right about that. She said at the time, or they said at the time, that they didn't feel comfortable with working with the whole economic reality. And I think that's to be respected. But for me, I think if you do have a group where there are people who are willing to deal with the whole economic perspective, alongside people like Liz and people like Morris and all the other voices in that, then you do get the opportunity for autistic people to make a real difference. You're right, it's the economics, but there are so many autistic people who could be part of autistic APO groups who already have a grounding in economics, whether it be in private industry or public service. I love what you've texted there, Raymond. Do you want to put it out in words?
Not really. I'm off on a Wiktionary page looking up the etymology of the word economy, because I do remember ikos in the Greek being something to do with house management.
Well, I'll take inspiration from your words. What you've written is a new economic reality, and eco is in the term. It's an ecology too, and that's right. The way money works and the way money is threaded throughout is like an ecology. One group pays down another group, money goes in different directions. It is part of it. It is like an ecology. But for me, the problem is that the purse strings, the money, is held tightly by a status quo. And if we as autistic groups do not accept that we have to be part of the money, we have to be part of that ecology, then we're not going to get a full seat at the table. That's how we keep being excluded. If we're not making decisions over the money, then we're not directing where value is put. And I see a lot of autistic people, like Liz in the conversation earlier, and to some extent Morris in the conversation earlier. They stand back. They say, I will only take my advocacy so far, but when it gets to this whole complication of money, they don't want to involve themselves. what I would want the people listening to this to know is that there are many, many autistic people who have lived lives and who are very comfortable with money as a specialism.
What I'm typing there is I'm kind of triggered into thinking we have to look for previous examples, historical examples where an imbalanced economy that held purse strings, as you explained there, was turned over or rectified. What's the word I'm looking for? Improved for the sake of a group who were treated disfavourably. I'm running out of words now. So to get a kind of... There must be examples where people who were denied funding were able to, without too much compromise, change the system in order for it to work. This is not going radically revolutionary in an alternate world or a counterculture, but to work within the culture and change it for the better. So it's seamless. Often when I worked in community in the past at the turn of the century in a part of Edinburgh, we took as an example what happened in the 60s for black people in the USA and other parts of the world, but how they were able to work their communities for the better. It was very, very difficult, but they served as a good example at times.
Yeah, I think whenever we discuss these things, we come across examples from the past of how people change things. And it is about protest movements, but it is also about cooperative movements that produce what needs to be done for that to be a model that's copied. What I see with my experience of autistic knowledge development is that they have worked strategically over years to not knock over the apple cart, but to work inside it and not give the excuse to people to be excluded. So they have then gradually worked to get enough funding together for them to produce a good model or a good example. And then when you've put that good model or good example up, it's quite difficult for the people who would otherwise grab hold of the funding to grab hold of it, because it goes above them. It goes to the next level or the level above that. The people above that can see the good example and say, right, we want it to be more like this. This works, this has got these outcomes, and we can measure them. So the way they're doing it is strategically providing alternatives that can be copied.
What I've heard from those groups so far has been kind of inspiring.
Yeah, and we'll follow them on Autistic Radio. Now, we want to continue our live broadcast, and we want to return to something that we started yesterday. We have one of our team, Lucy, with a Substack, Autie Unmasked. I'm hoping that you're going to read something out for us, Lucy, today to talk about. Is that okay?
Yep, absolutely. And I'm completely ready when you are to go. So, yeah, absolutely. So, what I would do is I'll start with this first little bit. The article was written in September of this year. It's called This Week in Glitches. Now, just as a little background, this was when it was a very early time for me, going out there and being part of a community, and you know, like I was only just really sort of coming to this point where I was able to go out and talk. I'll read the piece to you. It's got some bits and pieces in there which I'll probably edit it out with sort of facts and figures and things that I'd found out at the time, but I will read the piece out for you, a couple of paragraphs at a time. So, this week in glitches. There is something in the air this week, other than the whiff of the last barbecues of a dying summer. Everything has been going so well. I've been surfing on a wave of adrenaline, buoyed by all the positive feedback I've had from my autism coming out to cyberspace. It's been uniformly wonderful and truly inspiring to know that my previously candid ramblings are resonating so strongly with people. I've been lucky enough to be invited to be a guest on a few podcasts and to write some articles. Amazing opportunities that I never thought would ever manifest. I also gave a talk to a local support group in a communal cafe where I spoke to many people who, like me, are finding ways to cope. I learned about others on the spectrum who share a diagnosis but display very different symptoms and comorbidities, especially some mental health issues. We spoke about the referral process and the wait time. It's now elongated to years and years rather than weeks or months, and it seems to be true. According to the latest NHS data, 172,022 people are waiting for an autism assessment in England. This is a 47% increase in the number of people waiting in just 1 year, an almost unbelievable number which makes me feel privileged and fortunate to have come this far. There are so many people still hanging in limbo. One of the attendees at my informal lecture had been waiting so long that the anticipation has made them question whether they are even strong enough to go on. I'm going to pause it at that little part there, so we can just discuss that bit.
Wow, I mean, that last bit, that somebody is finding getting diagnosed so difficult that they're questioning whether it's worth continuing the diagnosis process is, well, it just says everything about where we're at, doesn't it?
It was really sad to hear. This was quite a young lady who had some other complications as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but she had a few health complications that were going alongside, you know, her diagnosis with autism, and she was quite introvert. She didn't really like talking, but we sat and I kind of, you know, we managed to get speaking about it, and she just felt that the longer she waited, the less she felt like she was going to be able to go through it. It's almost like the way that I always say, if I'm going to have an appointment, I want it early in the morning so I can get it done and out of the way. And because it was so far in the distance and she was kind of galloping towards it now and nearly there, that she started to doubt that she was going to be able to be strong enough to go through it. And you just wonder about these protracted waits that people go through in order to get their late diagnosis, or you know, because as everybody there was adult, whether there is this tendency just to say, look, you know, I am what I am, and sort of back away from it because you're just too frightened to take that last step.
Was she offered an advocate at all? Because I fear for people who get into that situation and then kind of like can't communicate their needs and therefore don't get what they're after, which is a diagnosis.
Yes, I do believe. I mean, she because of some of her other health problems, she did have somebody who was kind of social worker. We didn't go into too much, but she did say that she lived in accommodation where she was looked after because of some of the things that were kind of alongside her autism. But I think it was just a simple fact that, you know, for me, I got my diagnosis quite quickly. But now it's starting to get to a point where people are seeing it as a far distant destination that they're having to jog towards, and it's exhausting to think that you're going to get there at some point. And she started to get stage fright because she's overthought it. And that's just the time frame that they're looking at now is too long for people, and they kind of want to just say, no, not me, I'm not going to do that, because they're just scared of what it's going to be like when they get there.
Or want to self-diagnose.
Well, this is it. You end up just self-diagnosing and never really getting I didn't want to spend my life feeling like I was not formally diagnosed. I felt that this was something I needed to do. I guess for some people they can just live with that self-diagnosis, but it does mean that there's no, isn't it terrible? Like you get kind of a rubber stamped and say, you're with this crew now. And I guess if you stay undiagnosed, yes, you'll find ways to support yourself, but some groups you may not find yourself, allowed into.
Yeah, it's like that sense of agency, isn't it? Sometimes, when I was going through it, I felt it was almost fated, things kind of fell into place. But there was a sense of agency there too, because I was kind of triggered by what a friend had said. And I thought maybe I should follow that path.
Yeah, and I think maybe a lot of people go the way that my process was a doctor who brought up the symptoms and sent me off to go and sort of discover for myself. And did say, it's time for a referral as far as I'm concerned. It was a long road to get there. Nobody had picked it up before, and God only knows I'd been in and out of mental health services for years and been given a diagnosis upon diagnosis upon diagnosis, which made me came away feeling kind of weaker. I'm feeling like less able to cope with me, because I was thinking, oh, there's something terribly wrong with me. But having that autism diagnosis actually made me stronger, because it was like, well, okay, I know how to deal with this. But yeah, I think everybody finds a path in. It's just how easy it is to get there, and have people around you who are going to support you during the process as well, of getting or a diagnosis. It just really depends. I guess you have to kind of have somebody have your back, or almost be behind you, sort of saying it's fine, and pushing you towards that diagnosis.
Do you want to continue, or do you want to answer a question I have about how it felt to be in the group?
I can. Well, I do have a little bit more. I could probably, that might answer your question if you want.
Okay, do what you wish.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I have to admit that this all felt like an out of body experience, not near death, but certainly near out of breath. I felt as if I was outside of myself, floating above, observing me, not in the security of an operating surgery laid out on a table, but standing exposed in a public space, pouring my heart out to strangers, being scrutinised and eavesdropped on by any normal patrons tucking into the cake and coffee close by. I was loudly confiding and baring my soul in a manner more conducive to lying on a couch and unloaded onto a sagely nodding therapist, rather than shouting over the clutter of cutlery. And I'll leave it there, because that's got some stuff in there we should probably talk about.
Wow, that description. The talking therapy. Sometimes that's all we need, is just to talk it out.
Yeah, it was a strange way to go back and sort of do it. I'm pouring my heart out to strangers. I was getting lots of nods and sort of smiles and people understanding, but I didn't go through. I had to, once I got my diagnosis, things kind of stopped in terms of support, and it's like I was buoyed up by having my diagnosis, and after that everything went quiet, and I thought, well, what do I do now? And having to then insert yourself into groups and mix with new people, and discuss it with other people like me. It all had to be led by me then, and find things that I could do in order to kind of get therapy through a group setting.
Yeah, I found the root of most of my issues goes back to a very similar experience that you just described. But when I was 5 years old at primary school, and it's that first time you stand up and represent yourself in your voice and in your being with other people.
Absolutely. I've been thinking back. I was thinking back a couple of days ago about my first experiences of school, and how those first few months in that environment were so troubling to me that it completely felt like I can remember myself being a tot and being in a classroom full of strangers and just willing myself out of there all the time, wanting to get away from there. I didn't understand how this should feel. And the first year was a struggle for me. I got better as I got older, but the first couple of years were a struggle just to be there and to feel comfortable there. As something that I still find very challenging if I'm going to be doing something. If I'm going to be going into a job, and I've had loads of jobs, it's really challenging to be there and with those people and try and kind of carve out some sort of relationship with them. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll read the next part.
Are you sure? Because we have plenty of time here.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if there's more to discuss, I can, or...
Yeah, let's not rush through this. There's another theme that's just popped in, and that is about after your diagnosis that you had found relatively easy to get hold of, and you appreciate that now that door is closed for a lot of people. It's really difficult to get hold of that closure, that diagnosis closure. You then had to go and find other spaces and other places yourself. And it seems to me that by far the majority of autistic people, because of autism, that thing that you did, finding other spaces, knocking on doors, and often enough feeling a little bit rejected or daunted by those doors. Not everyone can do that. And if people are going to support us, giving us a diagnosis, then leaving us to our own devices is not good enough. Giving us a diagnosis and then giving us some kind of well put together short course to explain autism to ourselves, that's not good enough either. What has to be done is to have a third thing following, and that is the networking support, a way for people who are naturally averse to networking and making groups and joining things, making it available to them in an easy way. And for me, this whole thing about having a diagnosis and then being dumped, having a course that explains the diagnosis and then being dumped, and then the next stage is if they do get it, if they do get some kind of networking opportunities, then the problem comes is how they are run well enough for people who are autistic to manage to stay inside those groups long enough to get benefit from them. Because there's a dumping that happens inside those groups as well, an internal rejection of autistic people. it's a 3-stage thing for me, and I'm not entirely sure that the diagnosis itself is of any value for people when you consider what's likely to happen after it. It feels to me that people that start from the other way round, that manage to get themselves held a wing around them from somebody else and involved in a group, might be doing it the better way round. Getting some autistic experience and support before going on to the flashcard explanation of autism, and then before getting the diagnosis. It seems to me as though we've got it not only the wrong way round, but we only go as a society to giving a diagnosis and dumping people mostly. Am I in tune with people here?
Yeah, well, in my experience, it was I worked really hard to get the diagnosis, and then I basically got sent, and this is all the support I got from that, a photocopied batch of paper, which was meant to really explain to me where I was at that moment and what I could be doing, and it was quite, they were trying to cover every base, and they obviously send this out to everybody after they'd done the test, and it had sort of like, how do you keep yourself organized, are you any good at money, but it felt like nothing. I've still got it because it's kind of laughable what they were saying on there, and it was, I found it that it was, they were trying to, and I know it's really difficult to make a publication fit everybody, but it was so very basic that I was like, no, just forget it, no. But I think people having to go and find some means of support after a diagnosis is just, it's difficult unless you can find that within you, find the energy within you to keep going forward and find places where you can sit and be part of a group. And even the group that I was next sort of placed in was so very general. It wasn't for people with autism. It was people with all sorts of different things in their lives which made them alienated, which meant I'm going into a room where I'm not with my people. So yeah, I suppose it depends, and I can see that everybody's saying in the text that that's probably more than you got. But this is the problem: there isn't much that goes on after a diagnosis at all.
Did what I say chime with anybody? I'm wondering whether we are doing... it's only really come to me recently. I feel as though we might be doing this the wrong way round. And that as diagnosis is so far off in the future, what people really need is, when they are questioning whether they might be autistic, they need a community involvement with autistic people that might give them some sense of certainty and support before they get anywhere near the textbook explanations that come on the flashcards in the support services that people sometimes run, and before the diagnosis itself. It seems to me as though we should be working towards a diagnosis rather than working from a diagnosis.
Well, if there's nothing being offered, really, you might as well act as if.
It would be good if there were, like you say, before you actually get your diagnosis, more of a support coming up to that, so that you know what you're going to expect on the other side of this. This is the thing. You go into doing this thing, but it's almost like, you know, preparation being the best way of doing this, so that you know that if you get to the other side of this, you'll have God, it's really difficult to put it into words, but yeah, like sort of you've been set up to be able to cope and know what it's going to be like afterwards, and know what you could do afterwards, and that should start before you go in for all the tests. And I had weeks of psychology and stuff, but you know, before I went into that, if I'd had a bit more of a chat with somebody who could tell me what it would be like on the other side of the diagnosis, that would have been great, really.
Sorry, I'm typing really fast here and making big spelling errors. But when I said as if, it's like, ask yourself, what would you do if you got the diagnosis? And then that leads to deeper questions like, what do you actually want from gaining this diagnosis and resolving aspects of your life and yourself? Like, what is the narrative that you're within here?
It's a big question to ask what you want out of it. I guess for me, it was just a validation, like a medical validation, really, that I was, you know, going down the right path. And and this is, you know, this is all I wanted, was that I wanted to have, I wanted my pain to have a name. And before that, for years I had been in pain through mental health and through being told that it's just a case of take this pill and you'll be fine. All of that had been churning in my background, you know, and it was horrible. Years and years of it. And so when I finally went, no, this is the road, and I did it, it was like like being in like some sort of like, just like all the pressure went. It was like I know now what I'm supposed to be doing. I know now that I don't need to be on 50 kinds of meds and being told on a regular basis that I had some sort of personality disorder. I didn't. But that's what I'd been told over and over. So what I wanted to get out of it really was to say, sort of, really up yours to the people who had said all these things to me before.
Up yours, great.
Because the mental health people were terrible. I mean, I've been under sort of different ever since I was a kid, and just nothing seemed to be right for me, and they were pushing me. I remember going to the doctors and having to list every single type of antidepressant and drug that I'd been on in the past, because they were running out of new ones to try on me. I'm sorry, I'm getting angry about it, but it's true. It was like they were going, well, okay, so what have you had in the past? I'm saying I've had Prozac, I've had fluoxetine, I've had mirtazapine, and they're going, right, because we're not really finding anything new we could put you on that's going to be any better. They were trying to give me stuff that made me drowsy. They were trying to give me stuff that made me feel kind of like better during the day, but it was all of this sort of guessing, and I got so medically involved with the idea that there was something fundamentally wrong with my personality that it made me feel less and less and less.
Positive swearing. I love when the body takes over from the mind.
Yeah, I guess I had it's like, you know, it is looking back and going, sod 'em all, really. It was a good place for me to be, because I felt, well, you know, I've been saying for years, look, you're not helping me. And there's been times when they've dallied with kind of, at one point they wanted to put me into sheltered housing. This is many years ago. And said maybe I need someone to look after me, and I never felt that way. But you know, it's like they were going to do that for me because they just didn't know what else to do. I'm quite able to run my life and to do my own shopping and all that. I got a social worker who came to see me who said she was going to take me out for ice creams and walks in the park. at one point. And all these things I'm going, why? I just don't need them.
It's really interesting because you're the first person who's really made a very good case for having a diagnosis first, because a diagnosis of autism for you was an escape from misdiagnosis of so many other things. And I think that's very much a female perspective, more than a male perspective, but it happens both ways. And so in your case, you absolutely needed the up yours to all these labels that people had, with the best will possibly, tried to attach to you. Each label had a different prescription that went with the label, and it's all an experiment. You know, medicine is called practice because that's what it is. Practice this and see whether it works almost. I think the medicine that you experienced was people experimental and trying with doses and trying with labels for you. That is the way it is. So it's the first time for me in your case that somebody has said, no, the diagnosis needs to be the starting point for me because I need to escape from all this misdiagnosis. The other good thing that has come from diagnosis from people has been to do with the benefit system, or to do with insurance companies, to do with things that tick a box. Diagnosis ticks a box. It feels though that not everybody needs escape from misdiagnosis, and not everybody needs a ticker box. And so I think for a percentage of our population, a softer, cheaper method of dealing with us would be for those people to have an introduction to the idea of autism through autistic groups that then follow on to a much more formalized explanation that then follow on to diagnosis, and other people will be going the opposite direction at the same time.
And I think it's probably not a case of one size fits all as well. This is the other thing. I mean, you know, everybody talks about spectrum. That's the problem, is if you've got something on a spectrum, then there is no one size fits all solution to that. It has to be really done with a one-to-one, knowing, you know, somebody talking to somebody about it and being able to talk about the different fears and or different feelings you're having, and what your level of comprehension of is going to be, how you're going to, you know, how you're going to process that. It's just going to be so difficult to be able to find a world where everybody gets the introduction to their diagnosis that they need. Okay, so we're going to move on. Sorry, I'm all out of breath after that. That was a very strong sort of... Okay. So, it was overwhelming. The amount of knowledge and new experience I took on board correlated exactly with the energy it took out of me. I thanked everyone for being so welcoming and for taking time out to speak to me, and left hurriedly. Back behind the safety of the front door, I felt a very strong sense that perhaps I'm not up to this, or deserving of these plaudits. The only real purpose behind talking about this condition openly and frankly is the hope that it encourages others to do the same. But inside, I started to wonder if I was really qualified to speak on others' behalf. I'm in no way a scientist or psychologist. All I really know is myself, what disorders hamper my life, and the eccentricities of my thinking. I've just been through 4 decades defying anyone, myself included, who told me to just snap out of it because I instinctively knew that something was off and there were missing pieces. And now, after all the psychological tests, the weeks of assessment and the final ADOS test, even if I still have the letter which confirmed my diagnosis, I felt a sickening ache that I am in some way about to be called out as a fake. And I guess that's really, I did feel that way. It's like I've waited so long and now I've got it. And then I'm meeting other autistic people and then I'm starting to feel like, am I up to doing this now? Should I be doing this now? Do I have the right to be going out and talking to people about diagnosis?
Well, sorry, I couldn't speak there. What bit of it feels fake? I think I understand what you're saying, and I'm trying to reflect personally, like why I sometimes feel fake, and I think it's because I'm kind of dependent on that external validation, and I've never trusted that. It's like unless I come up with it, it's not really real.
Yeah. It's like when I told a few people that I was autistic and they told me I didn't sound, act autistic. I mean, my next little bit here says that this was a touch of imposter syndrome, that the sense of being a fraudster, a trickster, unworthy and incompetent, even with tangible evidence to the contrary. I couldn't shake the nerves and the jitters, and at that time I was sleeping really badly and my head was really spinning with it all.
Uncertainty is difficult, but I think it's something we need to embrace, because if we can relax into that and get a measure, well, not a measure of it, a dislike measure, um, a way of being with it, it can be quite a positive thing, you know, because we are unwilling to accept all these givens. But it puts you in a very fluid space, which is quite uncertain and a wee bit nerve-wracking, yeah, because we are all conditioned and used to looking for that kind of solidity and security. In fact, society is kind of addicted to security.
I guess as well that part of my feeling at that time was that I had been through the kind of testing, and they did a lot of it was a really long process, and I'm really surprised that other people are saying that it was quite quick or whatever. For me it was like weeks and weeks. I was going to a little hospital right out in the sticks, and I was going back every week for another session of 3/4 of an hour chat about things and being asked to explain how I lived my life to them. So when I hear that people got diagnosed really quickly, I think, wow, because I by the end of it, I had to go for this whole little test thing, the ADOS test, I think it's called. And I thought, well, maybe I was just giving the answers they wanted to hear. That was one of my insecurities, was that, did I do this right? Had I passed this exam on my own merits, or did I cheat a little bit in order to get this diagnosis? That was kind of how I was feeling.
I find that telling about how the system is. And I think it's about money, again. Because the way you were diagnosed required an awful lot of input from an awful lot of different people, some of whom quite serious senior levels on high hourly rates. And it feels to me as though what you were put through was an overcomplicated system, when I'll explain my situation, which was to realise I was neurodiverse, and a year later have an appointment with a specialist psychiatrist who was familiar with autism. And during that 1 or 1.5 hour conversation, she was easily able to determine and write a letter that was not a tick box exercise, but had relevant sentences in it which related her experience of me in a video call to the diagnostic criteria. And that was absolutely sufficient. One highly developed person with a good knowledge of autism and a subject who had already got some kind of information on autism and knew the things that they should mention. It's an overcomplicated process for a reason. It's an overcomplicated process mostly because the status quo requires people to go through the different channels and make sure everybody gets a bite of it and paid along the way.
And it was really complicated. They wanted to speak to my parents, who were elderly at the time and couldn't come all the way to where I lived to speak to them. But they wanted, they want to know somebody who knew in childhood. Well, I know myself what I was like in childhood, really, because I remember it. But that, they wanted that. I was doing things like miming, making a cup of tea, and there were just silly things. And the actual test itself at the end it felt quite as if it was more attuned to a child. I was looking at children's storybooks and being asked to read expressions on the faces of the characters, or given like sort of little toy animals and cars and say, can you make a story out of this? And there I was at 43 thinking, well, no, because I'm not 6 anymore. But it was like there were so many bits to it that I just thought, well, that seems a little bit odd to ask me that at this age, when I'm pretty sure of myself that I'm going down the right path.
It sounds like a classic psychological test, sometimes what they use for very young people too. And it also sounds like how the test was described to me in about 2018-19, when I was initially thinking of putting in a request. So then COVID and lockdown and waiting lists. Eventually I was kind of in shock when I got the letter saying turn up in late 2013. But by then it was similar to Jules. It was just this like almost a 1 hour conversation with a psychiatrist or psychologist. Can't remember. NHS anyway. And yeah. So something changed there in the process.
The racket I see are private consultations to give you an autism diagnosis. Whether you're a child or whether you're an adult, people are now turning to these things, and the more they can do, the more different tests that they can do that you can already do yourself. You can find these tests online anyway and go through them yourself. The more processes that they have to pad their service out, give it credibility, and then charge for, the better as far as they're concerned. This is a monetary scandal. It's a rip-off. It can be justified in lots of different ways, but it's still a rip-off, and it's bad for society.
I'm thinking maybe, there's such a, I think it's become so very, it's like it's got bigger and bigger and bigger, this autism thing, she says. It's got so much bigger and bigger and bigger. People are starting to go down that road quite a lot more than others. And, it's like it's suddenly become a thing that people self-diagnose themselves with, and they just, they don't mind paying out that money for the test and all that sort of thing. It should really be as simple as it was, just an hour-long talk with somebody who really knows what the subject's about, and then coming out the other end and going, yeah, that's it, it's done, and it was all done in an hour, would have been perfect for me, because it was like something you would give a child, and that's why in a way I felt a little bit like I'm an imposter here, because the test was, I just felt weird with it. The whole sort of, is this person in this picture book, what are they feeling? And it was a little bit condescending, I felt, but maybe they were trying to like a one-size-fits-all diagnosis tool.
My takeaway, very basically put, is that in the very early stages of development, there's some breakdown in connection and communication, and sometimes that's what these tests are trying to reveal or discover.
We already have a number of different models to discover people's autistic identity that don't rely on 1950s ideas about locked-in syndrome, refrigerator mothers, and autism being a communication impossibility, which is almost how it is framed in the medical literature up until the 2000s. And after the 2000s, there's so much information out there that could be adopted by the professions that make everything that you've experienced unnecessary. And I would say that what we experienced here in Scotland is a move towards that. A single person making a sensible decision from their own experience and knowledge, rather than these committee-based situations that sometimes happen. It feels as though we are being used as a group, as a disabled group, rather than being supported in many quarters. It feels as though we are justification of people's services and wages more than we are a valued member of the society that needs a little bit of support. Changing that is a really big ask, but it is happening, and it is going to happen gradually over time. More and more professionals are realizing that these outdated models need retiring. But my concern is that we have to get to the younger people in the professions to reinforce their concepts of autism as a neurodevelopmental or a neurological difference rather than a neurodevelopment impairment. That's the task.
And I think there is a need for, in the workplace as well, for people to be prepared for what they need to do to help to support somebody with autism. And I've worked in a lot of different jobs where, I've only been there for a short while because there's no place for me there, and I didn't fit in because, I couldn't I couldn't get with the beat of what's going on around me. I was doing things in my own way. And, you know, there have been jobs where I've basically been ejected from them because they said that I'm not doing the right things. But nobody ever really knows how to deal with a new member of staff who comes out as autistic. This is all my experience. You know, I'm not generalizing, but you know, some of the places I've been have been really snippy about it. You know, they didn't want to make it comfortable for me. They just wanted everything to work out so that I went by their rules and sort of danced to their rhythm. And I think that it's all right getting a diagnosis, but when you go out into the world and then you start presenting yourself that to people and being honest, I'm autistic and I would like to join your company, but you need to do this, this and this, you get ejected from that.
Yeah, everybody's insecure.
I think what I'll do is there's not very much left of this now, so I'm going to give you the last paragraph. So I have at that point I was sleeping badly, feeling rotten, and my head was just spinning with everything. I was so nervous about it all. I said, but this feeling is not going to win. Even if all I ever do is speak of my own experiences, then so be it. Every day, for pretty much every autistic person, it is a mental battle to be part of the crowd, to colour within the lines and conform. Surely the work it takes to disguise oneself makes imposters of us all. It's too late for me now. After 40 years of introspection, I'm out there and I've thrown away my crayons.
Is that a sense of relief at the end of the day that you've got through this and now you're in a better place?
Yeah, my relationship with my diagnosis has changed since I first got it, to a point now where I can sit and talk about it and feel actually pretty okay with it, and feel that I'm part of a society of people who, you know, they think differently and have different ideas to mine, but you know, we can be out there and different and weird and be proud of that. Acceptance, self-acceptance is so much better than having to get that validation elsewhere. And that's what I've always worked on. I have said a number of times, I don't need other people particularly. If I have to, I'll sit in my own space and just do what I do. I've never sought out a crowd that I had to fit into. I insert myself into places and people just have to deal with it. But now I do feel relief. It's nice to be able to be in a place now where, you know what, it's okay. You know, I can tell people how it is. I won't try and. There's no mental battle anymore. It is as it is, and I can push myself forward and do things that are scary, and honestly, it feels great when you've done them.
Do you find when you're in your personal space that things come to you?
In a sense of how, what do you mean by come to me?
Well, I've noticed when I switch off trying, there's a kind of serendipity that comes in, you know. Things kind of randomly kind of make sense. I'm not trying to make sense of them, and sometimes the best people I've ever met and the best relationships I've had and involvements and engagements have happened in that space. I've not been out there actively trying, you know, pressurizing myself, getting all uptight about it all. I've let it all go, and then wow, something turns up.
Yeah, I have a bit of a sense of this. When you're trying to self-direct, when you're trying to create a future, and say that it should be like this, and I'm going to try and make it like that, you've narrowed your focus to such a degree that you're more likely to come against blank walls because you've got a very specific thing in mind. But if you can get yourself to a position where you're relaxed enough to be open to notice the things around you and go with the good things and find, instead of seeking out, I must go to this party and I must meet a girl, to get to yourself a situation where you're wandering around your life and you're more open and accepting that when a girl speaks to you, you're happy to speak back to them, and it's in a situation that isn't pressured and you're just being yourself. That's when you're more likely to strike up a relationship. It's this trying too hard so you're focused and you're unable to notice what's around you.
And of course, it's easier said than done. Sometimes what happens is people respond to you as you are, and we end up with those relationships and people. Like if we're high energy or whatever, maybe we attract high energy, or the opposite. It all depends on the balance. But I think, yeah, we're maybe agreeing on a freer kind of space with less self involved, where it's not all about us. But then that sounds a bit too judgmental.
Well, for me, this comes back again to the, if we take the idea of diagnosis again, and I put forward the proposition that for some people, finding community first, then finding explanations, and then finding diagnosis might be the right way round. And the reason I put that is because if you've got this idea that you might be autistic and you hang out with autistic people a bit more, you're going to end up with a serendipity of understanding and explanation by being open to being around them and noticing difference and similarity. And that should give you much more of a foundation of your own confidence when you are then confronted with some strong information that might conflict with your identity a bit. So putting people in amongst other autistic people feels to me like that's where people get their quietness, their confidence, their ability to be in the moment and get the best opportunities to understand and explore things, because they're not progressing on with this single focus of getting a diagnosis.
And also, having a diagnosis is not the end of the line. It's not like you get there and that's it and that's the end and everything's where it should be. It throws up a whole lot of new questions in your head. Where do I go from here, and what do I do? And do I accept this or reject it, which is something I did earlier on. I didn't find that, getting past that point, some people were quite staunch that they didn't think that I was autistic, people that I knew and who were quite close to me. So from that point on, it's really having the courage to tell people that you don't know what autism looks like, and I am autistic, and thank you very much, and that's it. It's the journey on from the diagnosis is a one that you have to tackle as well.
I haven't actually told anyone apart from services and GP and one autistic friend. Oh, and here.
Which is fine. I mean, it really is. It's everybody's business, you know, that everybody's personal business what they do. That once that diagnosis is there, who you tell and whether you want to tell people is a choice, and that's a big thing. And everybody's got to do it their own way. I mean, I wanted to tell everybody because I just felt really like I wanted everybody to know that this is what I am. You know, I still have some social life out there, and I do have family, and so I wanted to tell everybody. I wanted to kind of put it to my chest and say, well, it's kind of there. I've got the medal now, and it's there and it's mine, and this is what I am. And now you all understand me better, or hope that you understand me better. Not always the way.
I'm thinking about, Captain Scarlet, that TV series. You remember they used to say Spectrum is green?
Yeah, I remember that. I like that.
Kids programs of the 1970s and 60s. This revealing your autism, I think, is a decision to make at every juncture, and it's not something you can take as a badge of honour that, yes, I'm entirely openly autistic. I'm relatively well known in my small town, and that means I have had disputes and fights with quite a number of people, disagreeing with them, and lots of other people who really get me and understand me. So I'm very Marmite as far as people go. So I tend not to emphasise my own autism when people have a negative idea of me, or if I'm going into a new situation and I'm angry and I've got to complain in a shop or take the world on again, I try not to have that associated with autism in any way, because I feel as though it's giving autistic people a bad name, because, you know, my choices about going around life is going to affect people. But as far as open with people where it's a longer dialogue, a longer conversation, or I am in a good mood and I'm happy to be an advocate out there to strangers, it just feels like a lovely, cool thing to be doing. It's a positive, freeing experience for myself to explain to a stranger who says to me, oh, you don't strike me as autistic, and not be offended by that and take that as a cue for me to go into my autistic radio advocacy mode. And I enjoy that. I enjoy that little bit of it. It's, you hand the people the word autism and they have got no fucking idea what to do with it. You know, some people immediately go to, oh, that's kids that can't speak. Or other people will go to, oh, I seem to remember that terrorist said that they were autistic and tried to get off the death penalty. You know, so some people have taken that word and then they're not going to easily be changed in their ideas of autism. A bit like people who are openly gay. You would be careful to say to a bigot, yes, I'm gay, but you would be more open with members of your family, you know?
Yeah, there can be baggage. It's like sometimes I feel I haven't told anyone because there's actually no one to tell. But it was something you were saying there about, oh God, I've totally forgotten now. I can't keep up.
Okay, finally. It's just a really stupid story, this, but you know, I wear it on the outside because, you know, I look unusual to the outside, being, you know, sort of shaven headed and DM booted and all this sort of thing. I went on holiday And this woman came up to me and she looked me straight in the face and went, "Are you poorly?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Are you poorly?" Because she thought because I had short hair that I'd, gone through something very tough. I said, "No, I'm autistic." She just didn't know how to react to it, because it was, she came and she made an assumption about me from the outside. And I feel really slighted by that. It's like, it's like, that was her definition of me as a poorly person because, I wasn't fitting in with my surrounds.
Wow, not fitting in with your surrounds. Great.
I was on a cruise ship, so I couldn't get away from anybody. But yeah, I wasn't fitting in there at all. I had a nice time, but it's like everybody there was of a certain kind, and as soon as you stick out as being unusual, it's like somebody comes over and asks you an incredibly rude question like that. It's like, wow, I can't believe you did that to me.
Yeah, and what are they all about? It's not like there's a dress code on a cruise ship, is there? I mean, this is the 21st century. But then, some people are eccentric little characters like that, aren't they? They're such stuck in their ways. Talk about, not being part of the surrounds. They're like totally embedded in it.
Yeah, I wasn't. I mean, it's no more than a floating hotel, dear. We don't all have to, sit at the captain's table wearing our best frock. And that's the thing is, like, I felt so very branded with this idea that there was something deeply wrong with me because I'm not doing what they're doing and going to the bar and the casino and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to hang out and go to a few different countries and get a bit of sunshine. It's like, I'm not here to make friends. I've never been here to make friends. I just want to do what I do.
She was probably jealous of your DMs.
I'm just trying to think it from the other way around. And that person may have been a cack-handed, bad at socialising person themselves, or they may just have been a judgmental twat. It could have been either. But my guess is that they were asking you, because you were on a cruise, whether you were on the cruise of a lifetime because you were going to die of cancer because you had short hair. And it just,
Sorry, that's really funny.
It just shows that what we do as a species is we make these quick looks at people, and it consciously comes into our head, oh, is that person poorly? Are they unwell? And some people are willing to just ask that as a question, and it's up to us to decide whether we go from that or shut it down. My experience of most autistic people is they shut that down immediately, and they shut that down in what is perceived to be the rudest possible way. I see online that people actually offer each other different cutting things that you can say when somebody says, "You don't look autistic to me," as though the best way of attacking back is to have some kind of smart ass answer, which I think gives you some short-term satisfaction. I have to say that I think I have become comfortable enough to play with people's expectations and sometimes just accept all those prejudices that are within somebody and see it as their failing, their difficulty, their disability, so that when they come out with prejudice statements like that, I see it as an opportunity to not exactly turn it round, but to confound it. A bit like confusing redneck Trumpist Americans with economics. It's not for everybody. What I do perceive, though, is that in general, the autistic people in our society who are vocal are not making friends. They're not representing us in a positive light in any way. In fact, we're building into the stereotypes that people have about us. So as we go forward, I'm hoping that more and more people will come out as autistic that are getting on with their lives, and they're not needing to aim for diagnosis, and they realise it about themselves, and they say, so what? But then they say, so what, and I am autistic, rather than so what, I'll just keep it to myself. I see that as the way forward, possibly.
It's never my opening statement. My opening statement is, hello, I'm autistic. You know, that's not how I do it. And honestly, and by the way, if going on a P&O cruise to the Mediterranean is on somebody's bucket list, then they're not thinking very high, are they? Sorry.
Okay, guys, I'm going to set up a podcast to play that we might talk about. This will give us all a bit of a rest from this. We've got a lovely little recording that we've made there talking about your blog, Lucy, and I'll get that edited out to put out as a podcast. I'm going to present now. And it will come immediately on. So I'm just going to say this is a recording that we made with Richard Ibbotson, Future Advocacy, Autism in Conversation, from, let's have a look. I can't see the original date, I'm afraid. I think it's August 2023, so it's over a year old. We're here with Richard today again, and he's looking at what the future of advocacy might hold and where the professionals receive their information from. What can you tell me about where you're looking to find your information about the autistic experience, Richard?
Thank you. Yes. I think in the past I certainly have gone to the books, the professional academic articles and so forth to find information on autism, because 20, 25 years ago, that's where the information was. There wasn't a lot of advocacy. There wasn't a lot of people speaking out from their own perspective about their experiences of being autistic.
So the books were written third hand?
Yes, mostly. There were, of course, some autobiographical stuff being written. We have to look to possibly the first kind of book by Temple Grandin, which is the first personal account I'd ever come across back in the 80s about the experience of an autistic person. And there are obviously still people writing books about and their own experiences and always giving us new insights and new information. But I think they still exist and are useful, but I think the way we communicate now and the way we learn is evolving and changing. We learn in short bits of information. And I think the world of social media has been particularly influential, certainly for me. And I'm no great social media expert. I'm very much an amateur in that world. However, I do find really useful insights from autistic people who are sharing their thoughts and their experiences on social media. And that's where I find useful stuff to share with other people. particularly if I'm, for example, if I'm doing training, and I do training for groups of people usually who don't have much, if any, knowledge of autism, or who are just starting to work in that area. And so the information I give to them and the way they're going to digest it and make sense of it is not to go through lots of academic journals and talk about diagnosis and its development in any great depth. No, what I'm going to do, and what I do, is illustrate knowledge about autism and autistic people through what other autistic people are saying.
Right.
Twitter, Instagram particularly. And indeed, some of the visual stuff that you can pick up from there is really good. A lot of people are learning through visual learners and pick up information visually much better than they do through listening to somebody lecture at them for an hour at end. And I think that's the way communication is changing. So I think that is helpful and is positive in terms of advocacy and autism and how we are now learning about people's experiences.
This feels like a sort of soundbite world, a bit like the politicians, though, doesn't it?
It is, absolutely. And yes, we have to have a balance between the sound bites and what we take from them, and the depth of knowledge and the depth of insight that sometimes we do need. So it is about, for me, it's about piecing things together. It's not looking at one or two sound bites and think, right, no, I've got it now. I know what I need to know. It's more about adding those personal experiences. If I can go back to my experiences of being in the audience at various autism conferences over the years and having maybe several presentations during the course of the day, and
Long
often
and boring. Yeah.
long and boring, but very, very worthy and well intended, obviously, and mostly forgettable as the years have gone on. But I know that audiences have always said that the best bit about that was when they got the autistic person up to speak. And yeah, I don't know how else to follow that, but yes, that's the no-brainer, really, isn't it? That's what you hear for so many years about these big events. It's the voice of the autistic person. What is happening now, I think, is whilst that is still relevant to hear autistic people speaking in that kind of setting where they take place, what we can also get now is a much greater variety of autistic voices. We don't have to listen to somebody for an hour. We can tune into their feed. See, I've got all the right language. And follow them on Instagram. And there's a 2 minute, or not even 2 minute, 20-second thing that I can see there. And I can say, that's a really good way of putting that. I hadn't thought of it quite like that before. I hadn't used that example before. I shall use that. I shall use that if I'm doing training for people around autism and the autistic experience. I can take this eclectic way of working and developing my knowledge and my understanding, and hopefully sharing that with others.
That feels really good to me. You as a professional are actually looking to follow different autistic authors who speak with their own voice.
Mm.
Are you typical? I know you can't speak for all professionals, as I can't speak for all, but, do you get a sense that autistic people are reaching the professions through those?
I do, yeah. Yes. Not obviously, I can't put any kind of quantifying judgment on that, but yes, I do speak to colleagues, and I say, have you looked at Neurodivergent Lou's Instagram account? And they say, oh yes, of course, I look at that most weeks or most days. So, I'm having these kind of conversations, and obviously people are also sharing me where they find good stuff. So it's a two-way process. So yes, I do think generally there's a move towards that. Having said that, there are still those who are focused on call it the heavier stuff, the academic research side of stuff. It depends what we're doing with that information, I suppose. Are we using the information, the insights that we get around autism and autistic people? Are we using them to develop our own knowledge and our own understanding about the world and people and how brains work and how people think differently? And I think that is the bigger picture for me, is about how this fits in with my many years of learning about myself and how my brain works, and actually doesn't work the same way as somebody else all the time or often. And that's fascinating, always has been fascinating to me, about how people's brains work differently.
It sounds to me as though you're working from a neurodiversity standpoint, the wide range of different brains that we have, how they're wired, how they're actually structured.
Yes, absolutely. And I think my enthusiasm for that is enhanced by our need in the world we live in now for change and to do things differently and to think differently. As you know, if we continue the way the world is going at the moment, we're on a very, very steep downward path to whatever.
I don't understand. What do you mean by that?
Right. If the world ever needed now people who think differently to help us, help society, help humanity survive over the next couple of centuries, it needs people whose brains work differently, who can think about alternative solutions to things.
That doesn't seem to be the way we're working, though. That seems you seem to be counterintuitive.
I know.
That is the way it's worked a lot in the past. If you like, the reason that neurodivergent genetics still exist in the gene pool is because there obviously is an advantage.
Yes.
If you think about the development of stone tools or ladders or whatever, it takes somebody with a different way of thinking to look at a material and think, what can I do with that? If you think about making dyes from plants, you can't just put a plant in water and it dyes some wool. You need a mordant. You need something else to add in there. People can only come up with that if their brains work in that certain way. And people can only come up with how to process, like how do you work out that you can eat acorns if you roast them and you leach the tannins out of them and then you can grind them to make flour? So there's all these very specific sort of skill sets, these ways of thinking that have got humanity to where we are now. And there's no reason why that won't be the case into the future, whatever that may hold.
Doesn't that also link into advocacy? Because at the moment, part of advocacy is about a discomfort with the way research into autistic genes is going, which might lead to a kind of quasi-eugenics, a social eugenics.
So that's a really massive topic for 10:25 on a Tuesday morning.
Yeah.
Sort of starting to wish I'd gone to cut brambles at the butterfly field.
It is part of advocacy at the moment, though, isn't it? There are lots of strands of advocacy.
Yeah, I think the eugenics thing is really very important because I think it's a very real fear for people in any sort of minority group, and I don't think that should be dismissed. I mean, I find research into genetics and causes of autism fascinating. And from a purely special interest point of view, I'd like that to carry on because I want to learn about it. But at the same time, there is definitely a line that, and I don't think it is being crossed. I'm not going to call anyone a eugenicist, but I think some research definitely skirts anything that's sort of looking to develop amniotic screening tools, for example, is worrying because it's a very clear path of why are we developing amniotic screening tools for autism? Well, that is so we can filter out autistic people from being born. So there are lots of channels, there's lots of directions of genetic research, and I think some of them are interesting and valid and if there's any application where any way that research can be applied to improving the lives of autistic people, and not towards filtering autistic people out of the gene pool, then those sorts of things can continue. But it's such an emotive issue that I think all genetic research just it can initiate a kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, a kind of, oh, this is bad. And it's really difficult to pick apart what we should be vocally opposing and what actually has social validity. And when it's something that affects you personally because of the way your brain works, it's really hard to keep. I know autistic people, we're supposed to be rational and logical, but when it comes to research that we may feel runs the risk of excluding us from existing, then yeah, we are going to get emotive. Of course we are. It's very difficult to retain that dispassionate stance when you read about this stuff.
So I suppose what I'm asking, Richard, is when you see the advocacy online, are there certain subjects that are accessible to the professionals and certain subjects that get closed down?
I don't know that I've seen that. What I have seen are trails of thinking and conversations and statements that I wouldn't necessarily agree with from an autistic person when they're talking about their experience and their autism. And you can ask me for an example, I can't think of any, but sometimes it's not what I don't do, and what I don't think anybody should do is unquestioning belief in what somebody is saying. I think the more information that is there, the more views, the more opinions, that's great. And it balances out in the whole.
Because any issue you're testing with as much as that example, you're also into advocating to bring the actually different voices to the fore, the actual voices raising a new point, not to be submerged under the toe-aligned voices, including the toe-aligned voices among autistic people who are a great problem in the scene at present, as advocating for the more actual, freely, reasoningly, analysingly speaking of us, in contrast to and above the water of the toe-align element of us. 20 years ago, the spin used to be that it was us who always were the original and the MTs who towed the line. That was pretty much a calumny on MTs, because it turned out not to be the case at all. There's quite a strand of the toe-align character among autistics too, and you can call that an evidential discovery itself. It has to be worked around.
Yeah, I think Maurice is correct there. There is a feeling amongst a lot of autistic people that a rigidity has formed in certain areas amongst what is okay to say as advocacy, towing a line, following a party line of some kind. And also there's something in what he says there about which voices, if professionals are taking information from TikTok and from X and the social media, that's a very worthy group, but a self-selected group of people who are able to essentially mask up and go into the non-autistic world and make a digestible soundbite for them.
I think Morris's point is very interesting, very valid. Because I think when people are newly diagnosed, now that you don't have to go to, one website to find out about autism, you can find out about it on literally every social media channel. And of course, algorithms will push you towards those with the biggest reach. And I think when you're diagnosed and you realise yourself, it doesn't have to be a formal diagnosis, but I think when you sort of get to this point where you're like, oh God, what's my identity? You end up kind of filling your identity bag. I'm going to make a really strange analogy here, which is completely in character. You kind of end up filling your identity bag with little sound bites, little things that you hear. And when you hear those from 2 or 3 places, you hear a certain viewpoint or a certain stance. You're like, okay, I'll put that in my bag. That'll stay. That'll be part of my identity. Because I think there's a certain vulnerability when you're newly diagnosed and trying to work out who you are. And you may feel a pressure from the community to unmask, because that's a really big thing that's sort of pushed within the community, is we must all unmask. And like that's not something you can just do overnight. It's also something I think people need guidance with and some reassurance, so that you don't end up effectively trying to unmask, but just putting on the mask of the vocal social media advocate. And that obviously poses a challenge when professionals or anyone is looking for testimony online, is that, am I actually just hearing repeated sound bites? Am I just really hearing 1 or 2 people's ideas and testimonies echoed by many people that have been exposed to that information, digested it, taken it on board? It's very difficult. It's certainly something I found really troublesome when I read things from, I'm not going to name anyone obviously, but you hear things from different people, you read things from different people, and you think, oh, is that how I should feel about it? Because I'm not sure that I do feel that way about it. It's taken me a long time to kind of be okay with going, actually, no, I don't agree with what that vocal advocate says about this issue. I feel a different way about it.
That's really interesting what you said there. I've got half a dozen questions following from that. I suppose what you're saying, it sounds as though if enough people say something, then you believe it, or you add that in, as you said, into your identity bag. If people keep saying you must think this or you must feel that, that's really interesting. And knowing when you're allowed to disagree with that, or allowed not to believe or take that or add it into your identity bag. Very interesting. If I can just, I'm also kind of conflicted sometimes by, if I read something that an autistic person has posted or is saying, and I don't agree with it, I mean, very rarely, if I ever have I actually said, no, I don't agree. Should I? As a non-autistic person, I wouldn't want to devalue anybody's individual experience or thoughts. But as a non-autistic person, do I, if I really felt strongly about disagreeing with somebody?
If there's an autistic source you can reference to use as arguments.
Mm-hmm. The first word that came to my head in answer to your question directly, Richard, is yes. Feel free, because in the same way that autistic professionals in the past have felt, particularly the medical community, have felt that they hold the only keys to what autism is. It's not okay for a developing group of autistic advocates to feel as though they solely hold the keys to what autism is. And in some ways, we need protection from some of the professionals like yourself who can move between both sides, both sides, I don't mean both sides, move fluidly between arguments and act as our protectors. We need protection often from autistic advocacy groups.
I think a way of looking at this issue is if you try and draw a parallel with, do I go for a massive topic? Yeah, let's do it. If we draw a parallel between middle-aged to elderly white men making decisions about what women can do with their bodies, Roe versus Wade. Like it's staggeringly obvious to me that the only person who should have a say in what happens to their body is the person who owns it, and having people who don't have that identity making a decision for a group with a different identity is quite obviously wrong. I think there's always going to be different voices coming from within minority groups, marginalized groups, and I think they all deserve to be heard. And I think what Maurice said about finding, if you want to disagree with something, finding a counterpoint from within that community, I think would be, if you needed to do it, would be the way to go around that. Because I think if somebody makes a statement or publicly disagrees with something originated from within a minority community, it's very, very easy for that to then get stamped on and go, no, well, you can't say that because you're not from within the community. And it's like a powder keg. It's like lighting a match in a petrol station. I think you end up then derailing the conversation. So I think it has to be done really sensitively. Yeah, because when you start making people feel like they're being told who they are and what they can do and what they should be by somebody outside their community, that's when emotions really flare up. And I do have a problem with people. I have a problem with the dynamic of the Republican Party effectively trying to legislate against women having control over their bodies. I have an issue with that concept. And when I see that concept transplanted into reflected in other situations between other groups, that's sort of the terms in which I see it.
Yes, that's a really good point. And more possible to do that now because there are more and more voices out there.
Let's give you some space to explore some of the questions that come up in your head, Richard, from some of the things that you've heard. Just take a few moments.
There was something that Liz, you said, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I've noted down here on my piece of paper about original thinking and original thoughts, and how we enable people with original thoughts and original insights to be heard, particularly when the majority might be saying something different, or the voices of the majority might be louder.
That sounds a lot like one of Maurice's topic ideas that we've got on the list.
Could I go back to social media, Richard?
Sure.
Because the way social media works is through the algorithm, as Liz said. And the voices that you will see and hear on social media have been voted there. They come to prominence because they get shared. Anything that creates an eyeball on an advertisement gets traction and currency. So for you as a professional looking at social media, it's being filtered in quite a skewed way. It's the orthodoxy that gets to the top, and it's also the controversy that gets to the top, which means that sometimes the autistic voices or the autistic advocacy that you see will either be at the angry extreme, which feeds into how people feel emotionally at a moment, leading them to share it, or it will be a majority view, a hegemony. And the more original ideas struggle against that.
Yeah. Yes. So I ask, you can ask the question, is a good original idea almost impossible to communicate or share effectively through social media because of those two extremes? When you said talking about orthodoxy in terms of how things get onto social media, how they get heard, you could also use the words democracy, and it's a democratic way. I know it's not quite as controlled as that. And I agree with what you said about the controversial opinions, things that get people's attention, may be heard. But the original good, the positive, the ambitious ideas that should be shared and need to be shared, are they being heard? I don't have an answer. I think it's a really good question.
I do find social media very useful in being inclusive in opinions and individual experiences, but also, which has been mentioned already slightly, is possible misinformation due to an individual's experience and their opinion. But it's still a good thing, though, at least not one person or organisation has taken ownership of the autistic experience and the way forward. I mean, my experience with the Facebook, because I do the social media for Autistic Radio, I'm adding new people all the time, whether it's organisations or individuals themselves or groups. And it just always opens new sound bites, opens new, especially quotes. Quotes are all the time come out and they're quite hard-hitting and very inspirational. Some you may not agree with, but it generates conversation. So I do understand that it's a balancing act as well.
I'm a bit staggered here listening to this all this time later, because the guy being interviewed in our conversation here, the autism professional Richard, at the point we were talking to him, had access to a network, the Autism Network, and a Facebook page with an accumulated engagement of a couple of thousand people that had been built up over 10 years of him having funding to do that. And he took that Facebook group away with him, leaving the autistic group without access to it. So even the program that he is being interviewed in, he failed to share to his own autism network. And at the same time, he had a LinkedIn profile. So we're talking with the guy about the importance of getting good ideas out there, but he fails to do it himself. He fails to network us as an autistic group, even though in so many other of the conversations he has with us, he says how important the work that we're doing is and how revolutionary it is. and how he sees it as a step forward. I couldn't help but butt in during Radio Days to point out that irony.
It's best for organisations being in touch and doing research and trying to keep as fair as possible.
I think a lot of it comes down to sample size. The more variety of voices you hear, and the more people you go in search of. So not just being a passive recipient of stuff, but actually looking for other voices. Then I think you get a better picture with the more pixels that are in it. Really clumsy metaphor there, but yeah, the picture is clearer the more pixels there are in it. So the more people's testimony, the more people's voices you hear, the more accurate the picture will be, more useful perhaps.
I'm now thinking of those pictures, those images that are actually made up of many, many smaller pictures that are then used for what the colours, and then it kind of, you see the bigger picture and you focus in, you can actually see lots of individual pictures. Don't know what they're called. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. You've refined that metaphor perfectly.
There's a word for it, but I can't think what that is.
Well, that's the artist's eye, isn't it, Richard? So, when we look at the future of advocacy, beyond social media, how do interest groups, autistic interest groups, get the ear of professionals that can make changes? How do we get the conversation going?
Can I add a sort of sub-question as well? And is it up to us? Is it up to autistic people in the community to create a proposition of value, a thing that professionals can access? Can we make it easier for people to find the information collated or not?
Absolutely, I think.
Well, I'm sorry, we've run out of time to find out what Richard thinks there. I'm going to go back to this during tomorrow's broadcast. We start at 2 p.m. tomorrow. It's almost, well, it is exactly 4:44. And regular listeners know that we have a drop-in group which is normally completely offline on a Sunday. You just need to go to our website and click on a icon and you come into a space where there's a text facility and there's a voice facility. A very simplified version of Zoom. And the 444 has a regular group of people that go and people who drop in. It's a drop-in group without need for any invite and any obligation. You don't need to tell us that you're coming. You just turn up. And if that day you didn't feel like coming, there's no issues. So people drop in and drop out without any worries. Here on Autistic Radio Days, we've taken it a bit differently. We've got the group, and the group are used to the idea of putting their voices out. So the 444 today will be myself and Lucy and Raymond just chewing the fat and discussing what autism means for us. Hi guys, I can see you coming in the studios in the background there. And remember today that we are broadcasting live, so swear as much as you like.